of Western intellectuals. It is not enough that propaganda is to democracy as violence is to totalitarianism. Professor Chomsky develops this thesis in a recently published book called Manufacturing Consent. He tries to prove his points by means of case studies. One of these studies compares the media treatment of the murder of Father Jerzy Popieluszko by the Polish police in October 1984 with that given to the murder of 100 religious victims in Latin America between 1964 and 1980. He finds that the murder of the one Polish priest was reported more fully than that of the 100 Latin American religious victims taken together. Professor Chomsky says this shows a bias, and so it does. My point is, however, that there are other examples of bias in the Western press which do not at all have the same thrust as the example given by Professor Chomsky. On 13 September 1977, Steve Biko was murdered by the South African police. A wave of publicity and indignation covered the world. The death of Biko was a contributory factor of the arms embargo which the Security Council of the United Nations instituted against South Africa on 4 November 1977. It was also a contributory cause of the cancellation of the cultural agreement which this country had with South Africa. In the Central African State, Burundi, two different races live side by side. The Tolwa Tutsi hold all power, even though they constitute a mere 15% of the population. The Short Bahutu form the majority, but they are exploited. In 3 periods of violence, these two races have engaged in wholesale slaughter of each other, in which the Bahutu especially were made to suffer. Reports in the media of these happenings were scarce, except in Belgium, and their political effect was nil. Now, this is an example of bias that does not fit Professor Chomsky's mold. Surely, the American military-industrial complex is part of his elite, if indeed it is not identical with it. Surely, the sale of arms to South Africa is of importance to this military-industrial complex. Could they not have stopped all this news about Steve Biko? Surely, if they hold the American media in the vice that Professor Chomsky describes, that would be all in a day's work. The truth is that things are not as simple as Professor Chomsky maintains. Another of Professor Chomsky's case studies concerns the treatment that Cambodia has received in the Western press. Here he goes badly off the rails. Professor Chomsky claims that during the Pol Pot era, from April 75 through 1978, a, quote, flood of rage and anger was directed against the Khmer Rouge, unquote. If we are to believe him, the publicity was massive, the outrage was overwhelming, and the propaganda campaign was conducted, quote, at a level of deceit of astonishing proportions. This is very far from the truth. Miss Juliet Golden, who is connected with the New York-based Cambodia Information Center, has tallied the numbers of articles, editorials, signed columns, opinions, reviews, and letters in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal for the years of the genocide. She has also analyzed Time, Newsweek, and the Far Eastern Economic Review. She has been just as careful as Professor Chomsky in the case of Father Popieluszko. And her numbers show that during the years of the genocide, there was no massive publicity, there was no overwhelming outrage, and there was no propaganda campaign. Chairman, I wish there had been, for perhaps then it would have been possible to save some of those people. For the entire 3.5 years of the Pol Pot regime, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal each ran a total of 9 editorials while only 4 appeared in the Washington Post. Throughout the years of the genocide, coverage of events inside Cambodia was sporadic. In 1976, 1 article appeared in Time. Newsweek did not mention the subject at all. When, towards the end of 1977, the representative of Israel to the United Nations mentioned the Holocaust in Cambodia, he was greeted with deafening silence. In April 1978, the House of Representatives in Washington passed a resolution condemning Cambodia. It merited only a 1-sentence dispatch in the New York Times. Professor Chomsky alleges that the Western elite marginalized critical discussion. Let me turn to the United States itself. In March 1982, the new republic began a campaign against the Environmental Protection Agency. Its head was accused of running down the agency and of using its budget for political ends. In April 1982, CBS devoted a 60 Minutes program to the EPA. In July 1982, Congress held a hearing. In February 1983, the FBI started an investigation, in the course of which 20 employees of the EPA were sacked. One of them was convicted of perjury and condemned to 6 months imprisonment and a fine of $10,000. Perhaps Professor Chomsky considers this a marginal affair. Well, what about Watergate? Does he think that is also small beer? It caused the fall of President Nixon. It also gave rise to a lawsuit in which an Attorney General, a White House Chief of Staff, and 24 others of various ranks were found guilty. And of the 12 members of the jury, chairman of the jury that delivered the judgment, 9 were women and 8 were black. Couldn't the American elite have stuffed a newspaper down deep throats? Chairman, let me go back to international affairs, to Israel. The Israeli incursion of the Lebanon took place during the summer of 1982. How was that war reported? NBC's Jessica Savage said that 600,000 people were left without food as a result. Now, the total number of people in the area where the war took place is 500,000. So there was something wrong there. The source for the number of 600,000 was the International Red Cross. But the Red Cross based itself on information from the Red Crescent, which is headed by Dr. Fatir Arafat, the brother of Yasser. The Red Cross withdrew its earlier estimates. ABC's Barry Dunsmore said, the Lebanese police estimate that 10,000 people may have died in the fighting, without mentioning that this number had also come from the Red Crescent, nor that the police had virtually ceased to exist in the south of Lebanon since the invasion of the PLO. It was clear to anyone who had traveled in the south of the Lebanon that the original figures of 10,000 dead and 600,000 homeless were extreme exaggerations, but they were nevertheless used by both Caspar Weinberger and Francis Pym in interviews given at the time. Chairman, I'm at pains to stress that I think the Israeli invasion of the Lebanon was a great mistake. Many Israelis think so too. My point is this. According to Professor Chomsky, quote, the United States is committed to the creation of a powerful and expansionist Israel as a strategic asset. The peace process of Camp David served to remove Egypt from the conflict so that Israel would then be free with massive US support to attack Lebanon, unquote. If that is the way things are, and if the American media are collectively the handmaiden of the American elite, did they not rather fall down on their job when they produced these bits of anti-Israeli disinformation and sent the American Secretary of Defense and the British Foreign Secretary up the garden path? Chairman, may I say in passing that I find it regrettable that a figure of such prominence as Professor Chomsky condemns the one little bit of peace that has occurred in the Middle East. Chairman, of course, the media are influenced by intellectual fashions. Of course, intellectuals like being part of a crowd. At the time of Israel's war in Lebanon, the fashion was to compare Israel with Nazi Germany. Newsweek drew a parallel between Beirut and the Warsaw Ghetto. Both Time and Newsweek carried the words Israel's Blitz on their covers. Jonathan Randall wrote in the Washington Post that the camps in Lebanon looked like Dachau and Auschwitz. One wonders how he knew. Professor Chomsky has not escaped this trend. In a book he published in 1983, he described the Israeli youth movement of the 30s, Betar, as a fascist-style movement. Nor indeed has the well-known Dutch columnist Jan Blokker, about whom I wrote 2 years ago in NRC Handelsblad. And lately, Bassam Abu Sharif, Yasser Arafat's media advisor, said in The Hague that he saw no difference between the Palestine detention camps and Auschwitz. So yes, intellectuals like to be trendy, but in which way did this trend benefit Israel or the American elites, which, according to Professor Chomsky, is its paymaster? Chairman, let me now further define my differences with Professor Chomsky. They exist at 3 levels. Let me now further define my differences with Professor Chomsky. They exist at 3 levels. The lowest level is that of insults. Professor Chomsky seems to believe that the people he criticizes fall into one of 2 classes, liars or dupes. Consider what happened when I discussed the case of Robert Fourieson. Let me recall the facts. This French former professor of literature wrote that Hitler had never ordered or allowed anyone to be murdered because of his religion or race. He was thereupon suspended from the University of Lyon. Professor Chomsky and a number of other intellectuals signed a petition in which Fourieson is called a respected professor of literature who merely tried to make his findings public. The petition protested against the efforts to deprive Professor Fourieson of his freedom of speech and asked for his just right of academic freedom to be respected. Fourieson then published a book in which he tried to prove that the Nazi gas chambers never existed. The book contains a preface written by Professor Chomsky in which he calls Fourieson a relatively apolitical sort of liberal. In my first article in NRC Handelsblad, I wrote that Professor Chomsky, through his reputation, had provided Fourieson and his editor Pierre Guillaume with an audience which otherwise they would never have had. Indeed, Guillaume himself wrote that their breakthrough was due to the, quote, inestimable support which Chomsky has afforded us, unquote. What is Professor Chomsky's reply to this? He accuses me of having a Nazi mentality, of being a Russian people's commissar. He writes that it is I who am giving Fourieson publicity. In short, I am guilty of tiresome deception, of lies and absurdity, of a pathetic and scandalous performance. Chairman, this is an attempt at intellectual intimidation. These are the ways of the bully. Professor Chomsky uses the oldest debating trick on record. He erects a man of straw and proceeds to hack away at him. But, Chairman, I am not made of straw, nor am I about to be bullied. Chairman, one last word on the Fourieson affair. When Professor Chomsky signed his petition, when he wrote his preface to Fourieson's book, The only point at issue was the suspension of Fourieson from the University of Lyon. Now, Professor Chomsky makes of this a case of civil rights, of freedom of speech, but this is a red herring. There was no more violation of Fourison's civil rights than would be the dismissal of a biochemist caught faking the results of his experiments. No university tolerates a professor of geography who believes that the earth is flat. Chairman, the second level of my disagreement with Professor Chomsky appertains to the role which the United States play in the world. Since the death of Stalin, Professor Chomsky writes, quote, "The balance of terror appears to have shifted to the West and its clients, with the United States setting the pace as sponsor and supplier," unquote. "Torture is now, quote, largely a free world phenomenon," unquote, he writes. The United States are therefore responsible for most of the political repression in the world. Let us see how this axiom leads Professor Chomsky astray. Again, Cambodia. Professor Chomsky holds that the American bombing provided the Khmer Rouge with the psychological ingredients of a violent revolution. Against this, I quoted Dith Pran, whose experience is the story of the film The Killing Fields. Dith Pran described Pol Pot's thoughts as a communist radical ideology fed by French ideas and a crazy sort of nationalism. Professor Chomsky is doubtful. Dith Pran is not, quote, competent to discuss the peasant society of inner Cambodia, of which urban Cambodians knew virtually nothing. Here, the Massachusetts professor belittles the man who has been through it all. Professor Chomsky continues to maintain that the Khmer Rouge engaged in wholesale slaughter of their fellow citizens because they regarded those other Cambodians as their torturers. In order fully to appreciate how bizarre this statement is, consider, Chairman, the case of the Chams. This Muslim minority had been living in Cambodia since time immemorial. They were twice doomed for their foreign race and for their reactionary faith. The majority of Chams nonetheless joined the Khmer Rouge until 1973, when the communists declared the Chams' distinct lifestyle counter-revolutionary. And as a result, in less than 4 years of Khmer Rouge rule, as many as 1/2 of the Chams were murdered. Now, can Professor Chomsky explain in which way the Khmer Rouge could regard the Chams as their torturers? Chairman, I do not here defend the deeds or misdeeds of the American government. It's not my job to do so. They can quite well do that themselves. The US Marines intervened 20 times in Caribbean countries between 1905 and 1965. It would probably have been much better if they had not done so. But if the Americans had never set foot south of the Rio Grande, would Latin America not have known dictatorship or misery? Certainly it would. And its economic development would have been retarded. If Teddy Roosevelt had not decided to complete the Panama Canal in 1903, Panama would today probably be the same backwards and forsaken province of Colombia as then it was. Professor Chomsky considers his country to be the chief cause of the political and economic underdevelopment of Latin America. That view is ahistorical and therefore shallow. The United States are not the sole actor on the world stage, far from it. Chairman, I now come to the third level of my disagreement with Professor Chomsky. It concerns the proper way of ordering the affairs of a society. In my view, any society needs a coherent set of generally accepted principles if it is to function properly. Certainly, a large and multiracial society like the United States, a nation of immigrants, needs such a coherent set of principles. For a long time, the Protestant ethic performed that role. I am not so sure this is still the case. If I am correct, that is surely a cause for worry. But the need, to my mind, is clear. I do not think Professor Chomsky sees that need. Perhaps he can enlighten us on this score. Within that set of broadly accepted principles, leadership is exercised by creating consensus. Thus, Roosevelt